Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Right now I'm going to start a multi-part series on the death of global liberalism. Now, when I watched the West's reaction to the war in Ukraine, one of my early thoughts was the previous international order, which had been sort of hegemonic by the United States following the Cold War, was over. And in this series I'll get to that. But I think it's kind of important that we kind of understand what we're talking about. So whether you call it globalization, whether you call it hyperglobalization, whether you call it globalism, whether you call it international liberalism, whether you call it human rights culture, all of these things stem from a particular view of how we as humans interact with each other and how countries, therefore, should interact with each other. And so, I don't think there's much debate in foreign policy circles, outside of the liberalist camp that I'll get to in a moment, that this post-Cold War social order has become extremely unstable, is now beginning to rapidly unwind, and that this has implications for pretty much everybody. So, I was waiting to kind of do this series until I'd finished reading John Mearsheimer's important article, Bound to Fail, The Rise and Fall of the Liberal International Order. I have a link to that in the description. But there are a number of key things that I think we need to discuss before we get started. The first one is, when we say liberalism, what do we mean? I have a separate commentary on that, again a link to that in the description, where I look at liberalism in the history of ideas. So, starting with Aristotle, moving to just briefly glossing over Thomas Aquinas, and then talking about Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Then how this impacted the United States in its formation, along with questions like discussions of Edmund Burke and others, and finally why this is a hard sell to push as a universal social philosophy. Now, the second thing we need to understand is the layout of the sort of foreign policy expert community in the United States. In terms of foreign policy experts in the United States, they tend to fall into one of three sort of intellectual camps. They're the realists, of which John Mearsheimer is probably the most visible exponent, and realism holds that nations and countries seek to provide for their security first and their influence second. So there are very few limits to what a country will do in pursuit of its own security. Treaties are not going to be particularly effective in restraining countries in this way, but they can be much more restrained in what they're going to do in pursuit of their influence. So what we can do is we can be cognizant of countries' security interests to avoid a breakdown in our institutions, right? And so realists such as Mearsheimer have been very critical of the West's efforts to westernize both militarily and economically countries like Ukraine. In fact, realists have a tendency of seeing this as a major reason for the war, and there's certainly a lot of truth to that. Russian President Medvedev invaded Georgia following the 2008 NATO statement that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join NATO. And my view is that in 2014, the seizure of Crimea was specifically designed to make sure that Ukraine could never join NATO. That also means that the current war in Ukraine can't really just be about NATO, because Ukraine can't join NATO with Crimea both claimed and held by Russia. So as long as Crimea is effectively part of the Russian Federation, and as long as Ukraine claims the territory, NATO cannot extend Article 5 to Ukraine, and therefore Ukraine now would face this choice between claiming Crimea and seeking closer ties to NATO, and so that's sort of a realist assessment of that. The result from the liberalist establishment, which is comprised mostly of Washington insiders and economists, tends to hold instead that if you want a more peaceful world, rather than worrying about other countries' security, we need to make sure everybody is economically interconnected, and that we have a general progression towards liberal democracy and individual rights. Typical arguments for this have been, no time in history have we ever seen a war between two countries which have McDonald's. Well, now we have. And so the liberalist assessment basically reduces to the idea that if we have enough regime changes around the world, we'll have a peaceful world. It's not countries and their interests that lead to war. It's illiberal leadership that leads to war. This is why, of course, the United States is so much more peaceful than, pick your authoritarian boogeyman, right? The realist rebuttal to that is that the United States, in fact, has been the most militant country around the world and has invaded more countries than any other. And liberalism, therefore, as a foreign policy doctrine, doesn't lead to peace. So those two camps are at each other's throats. The liberalists tend to consider the realists to be Putin's useful idiots. The realists tend to consider the liberalists to be dangerous warmongers. And then we have the third group, which are the constructivists. Constructivist thesis is, okay, countries need to pursue their security, countries want to pursue their influence, yes, we get that. But how we interact with each other is much more based upon our perceptions of each other than it is any realities. So why is it that, in the United States, we perpetually look at Russia through Cold War lens, right? Why is it that, Time magazine seems to suggest that the Orthodox Russian Church has taken over the White House when they mean the Kremlin? And why is it that our perceptions of other countries are the way they are? And are those perceptions accurate or not? And therefore, the constructivists normative solution is that, yes, we need to be mindful of other countries' security interests, but we also need to be mindful of our own misperceptions and of the misperceptions of others. So constructivism brings a perception dimension to what is otherwise kind of like realism. And in fact, you'll see realists like Mearsheimer apply what's basically constructivism in terms of how other countries will see our actions, right? But they don't tend to look at why do we perceive countries the way we do? And that's probably the big difference between the constructivists and the realists. So, the article that I'm drawing from here largely, and extending and discussing perhaps some shortcomings of it, comes from the realist camp. It's therefore very much a systemic analysis rather than an ideological analysis of global trends. Liberalists put ideology first. Realists tend to put some sort of systemic analysis first. And constructivists put psychological assessments first. So, having gotten to that, now let me discuss Mearsheimer's thesis in just a couple minutes, and then we'll come back probably tomorrow for some very specific points. Mearsheimer's thesis is that during the Cold War, you saw abounded basically a number of communist countries binding together for mutual aid. You saw a number of pro-Western countries binding together through mutual aid. Sorry. But these blocs tended to respect each other's security considerations, and they tended to be willing to cooperate where it was useful or necessary. That this was swept away after the Cold War in favor of a number of international institutions which aimed to reduce the barriers to trade between countries. Major aspects of that liberalization of markets ended up being significant efforts to integrate both Russia and China into this global liberal framework in the assumption that this would somehow turn them into liberal democracies. However, instead of that happening largely, what this has done is it's led to a series of problems both in the United States and in Western countries on one side, as well as globally. These have included a rising gap between rich and poor, and resentment over things like open borders. So globalism tends to, in Mearsheimer's view, engender its own resistance. Additionally, globally, many countries simply didn't want to be liberal, didn't want to socially liberalize. They were happy to take advantage of global markets, but they didn't want to change governments in particular ways, and they haven't wanted to change their societies to be more individualistic. As a result, what's happened is that money and power has effectively flowed from the hegemonic state, the United States, that has been sort of the unipole of the world, to countries like China, to countries like Russia, to countries around the world like India. And consequently, these countries are rising up now and developing to a point where they're able to challenge the United States in various aspects of foreign policy. And this is a pretty tough thesis to argue against. I think even liberalists would agree that liberal democracy is on the decline worldwide. The countries that we thought were liberalizing are in fact not. You can look at Poland or Hungary or India, or frankly even China, as countries that we thought were going to liberalize their economies internally, that we thought they were going to liberalize their governments, their societies, and of course none of that's happened. In fact, many of these countries have gone the other direction. So if liberal democracy is on its way down, if the idea of individual rights as defined by liberal Western powers is on its way down, then what's going to replace it? And what Mearsheimer thinks will replace it is a series of sort of close bounded orders where countries are on the same page, as well as sort of a more realist-oriented foreign policy between great powers. So Mearsheimer, I believe, would expect that after this war there would be more of a realist assessment of U.S.-Russian relations, and that U.S.-Chinese relations are already moving in a very realist perspective. And I think you see this with Taiwan, and that the U.S. government's reaction to the question of Taiwanese security isn't really to do much other than to try to build a larger shipbuilding business in the United States. So this is something which is sort of interesting in this regard, and I think I'm going to leave it here at this point. And next time I'm going to talk about sort of the rise and fall of liberal democracy, and this isn't something Mearsheimer covers in a lot of cases, but I think that as somebody whose primary formal education was in history, I think there's a lot that I can offer here. And actually, speaking of that, it's like if you look at the three main objectives, or the three main camps of foreign policy experts, I've already mentioned that the realists tend to be academic foreign policy people. The liberalists tend to be economists and Washington insiders. But what does that make the constructivists? Well, Michael Rossi has said that the constructivists are basically people with history degrees who got, foreign policy academic jobs. So there's this question of cross-pollination of ideas there. So next time I'll talk about the rise and fall of liberal democracy, and the rise and fall of the major global sort of the major institutions of hyperglobalization maybe after that. So thank you, have a great day, and talk to you later.